you guys, Facebook friends. Good to have you guys join us. Hope you guys are still getting your vitamin D, because a lot of us are getting it out here today. So, my name is Jay, and I am one of the pastors at One Life City Church. And today we're continuing our series through the book of James. And kind of just to give you guys a framework so you guys know what's happening, next Sunday is going to be our last sermon for this series. And then we're going to go into the Advent season, which means we're closer to the end of 2020. Right? Come on, clap that out. Right? Celebrate, man. There's a sigh of relief that this crazy year is slowly coming to an end. Although we might still be we'll probably be in the pandemic, but at least 2020 will be done, right? And how many of us just need it to be over? If you've been present throughout the sermon series, then you know that the book of James, it's been super relevant to the current times that we're living in. And James has given us some prophetic exhortation on how the church can continue to be faithful during these tumultuous times. And today's topic, being doers of the word, is going to be another relevant topic for us, or another relevant exhortation. So let's just jump right into our text. Our text today, our primary text at least, is James 1, 22 through 25, and that'll be on the screen. Give me a quick minute. But let's read this together. Let's read God's word together. So verse 22. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror and, after looking at himself, goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. As we look at 2020, or when we finally get out of this crazy year, we'll see a number of things leaving its mark on not only the year, but I feel like a lot of us. So much of our lives and how we've lived and engaged with others, it's been shaped, it's been drastically changed. You have COVID, you got elections, you got all the protests, you got economic hardships, right? Just to name a few of the major ones. And one of the markers of this year that for me deeply deeply saddens me and unsettles me is the way the church at large has been present through it all. And I'm going to just put this out there. 2020 has put the hypocrisy of the American church on full display. You have a response to the Black Lives Matter protests for the church, a lot of the church. So this is everyone. But the church at large was calling for unity instead of the church owning the ways that it has perpetuated racism for centuries. You have the COVID closures, right, where churches were in defiance to in-person gathering restrictions instead of, and calling it religious oppression, instead of practicing wise and compassionate response to a public health crisis. So here's an encouraging story, kind of, and it's also a little sad. One of my neighbors reached out to me, knowing that our church was handling the crisis differently, and or the virus differently. And he wanted to let me know that him and his wife were appreciative of how we've taken this pandemic seriously. And it made him curious, because he's like, what are these guys doing? Because he knows that we were online for, 7 months, right? And so for me, that's encouraging. But it's also convicting of what the church at large has been doing in handling the COVID closures. And this kind of sealed the deal for me. Politics. The church had aligned itself with a political figure and party as if God is aligned with a particular political party. And this is on both sides here. So just so we're clear. But there was a clear siding from the white evangelical church with Trump and the Republican Party that to this day has not been shaken. And just to be clear, both parties, okay, well, to be clear, God is not aligned with either the Republican or the Democratic Party. If you missed Tommy's message last Sunday, go back and listen to it. Both parties are a system, a part of a system that continues to keep the rich in power. And so there's not one or the other, right? God's not part of either of them. God's above that. And so the hypocrisy of the church is not only de-evangelizing this next generation, it's also turning away those who are already skeptical of the church, which seems to be a growing number of people. Now, is this harsh? Yeah. Sunday morning. This is it. It's an indictment on the American church at large. And hypocrisy is not just a plague on the witness of the church, it's also hurting the soul of the church as division deepens within the body of believers. How many of us have already felt like eggshells trying to talk about certain topics with people that we know are part of church? Maybe not this, well, maybe the church, but maybe friends that you have walked with in the past, that on Facebook you're like, man, it seems like there's a rift that continues to grow deeper and deeper as we engage in this year. Now, I don't want to call out the church at large and not take an honest assessment of our church here. That would be pretty hypocritical of me. Unfortunately, we as a church, we're not immune to hypocrisy either. I believe as we would have some open and honest conversations, that there would be people sharing how they've been hurt by how we've talked about certain values and then not lived it out altogether. We're culpable too. And as one of the pastors and leaders of the church, I want you guys to know I need to acknowledge where it's happened and work towards making it right. And here's where wisdom from James speaks to the hypocrisy of the church. And I believe James gives us some handles on how to work through our hypocrisy. So the first point I have is this. Hypocrisy is self-deception. Verse 22 says, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. And I love what James does here, or at least what he gives us, which I believe is a diagnosis of the problem. See, the issue of hypocrisy isn't that we need to just try harder. How many times have we said to someone, or someone has said to us, dude, stop being a hypocrite. Maybe you didn't say it out loud, but you thought it, and you wanted to say it to that person. That statement itself, it's not very helpful. If you think about it, it's like saying, I just need to try harder to not be a hypocrite. I need to work harder to follow through on what I say, or I need to try harder to change my behavior so it aligns with what I'm saying. If you guys follow all those statements, can you start to see how these thoughts work to perpetuate the sin of self-righteousness? It's all on me to make it better. I can do it. I can be different. But that's not what God's word says. And so before we can address our own hypocrisy, we need to understand and acknowledge that it's self-deception. There might be some truth, and the way it works is that there might be some truth to what we hear and believe, but it's not the complete truth. And in the context of this verse, the deception is believing that hearing God's word alone is sufficient for righteousness. What's missed is the other part that says we must do what God's word says. See, our lives must conform to the word and will of God. It goes hand in hand. An example of maybe how this works is, have you guys talked to someone? Have you guys, I don't want to say just confront, because that sounds very conflictive. But have you guys talked to someone about being hypocritical? And as you're listening to them share their reasoning, or how they made that decision to do what they're doing, it just doesn't seem to add up. There are holes in their thinking, but the thing is that they usually don't see it. Or maybe they do, and they just don't want to acknowledge the holes in their thinking. See, that's the self-deception that James talks about here. And if it's not addressed, it can lead to others being deceived too. And so what's the second part to this? If we understand that our hypocrisy is not rooted in necessarily our will to do or not to do something, but it's at core, it's kind of this mixed understanding, this partial understanding, this incomplete truth of the larger picture. Verse 25a has the next part for us. And it says, "But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom." And let's break down each part of this verse. The first part is this: look intently. In other passages, this word in the Greek is defined as stoop, right? It's the act of bending down or leaning over. And I love this because in this way you are giving your full attention, right? Maybe you're walking by, but when you stoop down, you stop, and your whole focus is on what's in front of you. And so looking intently at what? The perfect law. And the ways that this word has been used is it's complete in all its parts, full grown, it means of full age, specifically of the completeness of Christian character. That's what the perfect law is. It's the fullness and completeness of God's will and God's values and God's heart for us and for His kingdom. And what does that do for us if we look intently at this perfect law? It gives freedom. Freedom from the dominion of corrupt desires, so that we do by the free impulse of the soul what the will of God requires. And how I would put this all together is to say that God's Word gives us the reality of who we were created to be and how we are to live as the people of God. God's Word is truth, and it speaks life over His people. And here's where I throw a wrench in my sermon, or at least start to make a pivot away from focusing so much on hypocrisy, because that's a heavy word, right? Our motivation to be doers of God's Word shouldn't be that we stop being hypocrites, or don't be a hypocrite, right? That's like saying I want to be. It's like saying I want to be caring to someone. But the reality is I want to do that so that I'm not a jerk. You just kind of get that? It's a weird motivation. At least to me, it feels weird. And probably a good rule of thumb for being virtuous is the virtue itself. And I believe God gives us a pretty amazing vision through His Word of how He sees us. His Word says that we are His workmanship, that we are new creation, that we are children of God, we're royal priesthood, holy nation, a light of the world. That's the perfect law, and that's what God's Word says about who we are. And friends, that should be our motivation for how we continue to align ourselves with God's Word, with God's will, and with God's heart. Is it dealing with the issue of hypocrisy? Yeah. But the motivation should be that God's given us this amazingly beautiful image of who we are and what He desires for us. So the question is, are we in God's Word? Where have you stopped short in looking intently into the perfect law that gives freedom? How can you get into God's Word? And I would press this as a church. There are 66 books of the Bible. And I feel like a lot of us only land on 10, maybe 15. And a lot of that is built in through just passages and verses. And we're missing the complete picture of God's Word. And here's the thing, as we grow in God's Word, we start to build discernment. And here's how it works. You guys might have heard this illustration, which is true. I researched it, and someone had actually gone to a federal building and researched this out. So this is real. Regarding counterfeit money, federal agents don't learn to spot counterfeit money by studying the counterfeits. They study genuine bills until they master the look of the real thing. Look and feel of the real thing. Then when they see the bogus money, they recognize it. They have studied the real deal. They have studied the $100 bill. They've studied that $20 bill. They've touched it. They know what goes into it. They know all parts of this bill. So that when someone gives them a phony bill, they would start to recognize that something's off about it. Something's different. Do we know God's word well enough that when we encounter an area of life or some situation that doesn't align with God's word, that we have enough discernment, that we know God's will, we know God's word enough to know that something is off about the situation? Maybe we don't have to necessarily be able to pinpoint it exactly, but in our spirit, can we sense that something's off about the situation? That's what I think James is calling us to when he says, look intently into the perfect law that gives freedom. The last part of this verse is in 25. So it's the second part. It's one long sentence, but it's part 2 of it. And it reads like this. And continues in it. So let me just put it together so it'll make more sense. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. This last part of the verse caught my attention. They will be blessed in what they do. Friends, if that's not your desire, to be blessed in what you do, man, what's the joy in it, right? That should be all of our desires, that we would desire God blessing us in what we do. And this isn't like monetary blessing, like I want that Rolls Royce. I want that watch. Not that, but it's blessing of God's favor upon our life. It's knowing that God the Father is able to say, son or daughter, good job, well done, faithful, I love you, I see you, I am with you. Who doesn't want that? Right? My daughter constantly is trying to get my attention. And so from the get-go, there's something in us that needs that from our Father. And then there's the part that comes before that, which is to continue in it, not forgetting, but doing it. And that continuing, the way that it's also defined is that it says to remain by, abide with, persevere in. I don't know about you guys, but living out God's word is not easy. It's challenging. And I don't think it's so much about the discipline of being in God's word as much as it is about obeying the fullness of God's word. And this is where I feel like church at large has continued to mess up. See, this is where we're called to remain by, abide with, persevere in, and will play out where we are working through parts of God's word that maybe we tend to skip over or ignore. It's the hard parts of God's word that says, go love your enemy, turn the other cheek, be generous in your giving, trust God in your finances. It's stuff that maybe in our human flesh feels hard. And it may not feel natural. But God says that that's the fullness of my word. That's the fullness of what I have for you. There's a warning in 2 Timothy 4:3 that I feel like maybe we're getting, I don't know, it's not necessarily a prophetic word that is only for a certain time. I think it's timeless. But I feel like we're edging closer to needing to hear this. And it says this, for the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions. So the church becomes about itself, not about God's heart and God's will. The course is off from what God has for us. And I think that's why there's so much division and hypocrisy that's being on display. Because instead of abiding by God's will, working through the difficulty of some of God's words, right, talking through it, having those conversations, people are saying, I think what I have right here about God's word is enough. It fits my view. It hits home for what I need. And I'm good with it. Because that's the deception of the church that I think is getting played out. And so kind of the last part, where if we are able to track with kind of how hypocrisy works, right? James says that it's a deception, that you have incomplete truth, you have part of the whole, that you've grasped onto that, you've made that enough for your reasoning, for your worldview, for how you have lived your life, right? that it's not necessarily that you're just not willing to work at it, but that you've allowed yourself to remain at one part of God's truth, whether it's just simply listening to it and not doing it, or some part of where God says, be generous, be kind, be loving to everyone. That somehow that's taken hold of people, and that's allowed hypocrisy to burn. And James gives us the next part, which is, man, it's not about compromising our view from there. It's about going back and looking intently at the whole, the perfect law, all of God's word, and allowing ourselves to become doers of it, to submit ourselves to the process of the arduous task of working through parts that make sense as well as parts that don't, parts that jive with who we are created to be, and parts that feel so off from how we are designed. Yet at the same time, God calls us to full surrender and full submission to His will, to His word. And the amazing part of that is when we do, we will be blessed in what we do. And one way that I feel like it's really stood out is it's a completeness. It's an alignment, right? When we sing these songs about Jesus being at the center of our will, that we can sing that wholeheartedly, because there's no doubt that every part of our lives, Jesus is at the center of our will. I may not be perfect. I'm not living my life completely, right, as God has for me, but I'm working at it. My heart's surrendered to Him. I'm trying. God says, let's do this together. I got you. So where do we go from here? If we look at hypocrisy, as we look at how we are aligning our lives, James gives us two specific areas of our life that I feel like really would help us to live according to God's will. And the first is this. The internal, James asks us, he points out, by being doers of God's word, the one area right now is the internal work of our heart and of ourself. James 1:19-21 says this. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. I feel like the first and probably the primary area that we're all to work on and continue to work on from now until we're in heaven is our heart, is our character. There's a sinfulness, right, that we got to work out, a habitual sinfulness, a habitual way of doing life that has been against God's will. That from now until we die, God's saying you got to work that out. Put off your old self, put on the new self. It's assessing kind of what's happening in the heart. It's taking an account of what's going on in here. And it's recognizing that we need healing, we need wholeness, that this is important. The other part of it, as far as the work that we're called to and being doers of God's word is this, the external work of our relationships. James 2:14-17 says, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but there's nothing about the physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. So I was intentional. I didn't want to title this or label this or couch this within the area of social justice or missions, right? Like that, there's a framework there, kind of, we got to do in-house stuff and then we got to do out-house stuff. That's not what James is getting at. There's a broader context of relationships that James is touching upon here. And we're not reading it, but in the full context of this passage, it talks about Abraham and Rahab. And within the Jewish audience, the Jewish context, they would have already known these guys are models of hospitality. And so where the church is tripped up is when one area is elevated above the other. Where it says, perhaps the internal work of the heart is more important. My righteousness, my ability to get into heaven, my ability to be saved is more important than the justice and the relationships that God called us to outside of church. Have you heard that? Have you felt that? Or it's the other way around, where it's all about relationships, it's all about justice, it's all about the other person. And we ignore some of the sinfulness that's in here, and we don't deal with it. Right? Just the other day, another pastor fell. Why is that? Was this an accidental trip that he got into an extramarital affair? Something was going on in here that was not dealt with, probably for years. And the fruit of that is a broken marriage and the destroyed witness of the church. The two go hand in hand. The internal work of our heart, the internal work of our soul, and the external work of relationships. And if you follow that model, it's this right here, right? God has made us righteous. And I got to work on this. I got to take it seriously. The stuff that I get called out for, whether it's at home or here, or friends, wherever it is, I got to listen to that. I got to take that seriously. I got to work through it. And then here, in my relationships with others, how I'm loving my neighbor, how I'm loving my family, how I'm loving my parents, right? This has got to be good too. I got to invest time into that. And it's not necessarily 50-50. There's seasons. But at the end of the day, both matter deeply to God. And the reason why it doesn't is hypocrisy. It's the de-evangelizing of those outside of the church. And the beautiful part, that as we do the work, which is hard, that's why we got to continue, we got to persevere, we got to abide, we got to remain in. James insists that faith must be perfected by works, verse 22. So you see that his faith, Abraham's faith, and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. In other words, we can see this completeness as our alignment with God's word lived out. The external work opens the way for us to experience shalom as we live on our faith. How many of us feel unsettled sometimes in how we're walking on our faith? We don't feel like we're walking in completeness. We feel like something's off. And I believe this is what directs us towards that experience of shalom. I turned 40 this year. Hard year to turn 40. But as I was reflecting on hitting this milestone, a lot was coming up. One of the primary things that I was feeling called to, and I didn't feel a full peace in it, is that I could be comfortable living who I am. Like I'm not being drawn by other people's expectations. But that in here, knowing what God has already done, knowing who I am, is enough. There's a sense of peace internally that as I engage with people externally, they would sense that. It would be a spirit of peace that I get to exude because the work in here has been done. How many more relationships, how many more encounters with other people would be more genuine when we ourselves are genuine people? How can we be a blessing to others if we're not feeling that blessing from God? My closing point is this. I know that hypocrisy comes with it, kind of a negative connotation. It's heavy, right? We work, it gets thrown around. And this year particularly, with all the disinformation that's being passed around, it just feels like everyone's a hypocrite. Like, do I keep my mask on? Do I take it off? Right? But the thing is that hypocrisy can be something positive in the context of our formation and growth as we follow Jesus. It doesn't necessarily have to be something negative. It can help point out areas that we need to go back to Jesus and ask for more of His grace and work through whatever junk is surfacing so that we would be in completeness, we would experience shalom with God who saves us. And that's a beautiful thing. Because we can say at the end of the day, hey man, I messed up. I'm sorry. And make it right with people. It's like the church is right. Instead of taking this practical response of this moral high ground, I have it. My life is good. I'm righteous. I'm self-righteous. I think that's what turns people away. But if we're able to acknowledge some of that brokenness, work through it, mend those relationships with others, and the church would grow. There would be reconciliation, there would be healing, it would give hope, especially in this day and age that we're living in. And so my prayer, my blessing to us is that we would feel confident in God's faithfulness to help us live this out. And I hope that I've given you guys enough vision for it that you go, okay, I can start to look at some of the junk in here. I can start to look at where some of my relationships have been broken. And maybe I can take at least one step towards that. So let's pray. Father, we need your shalom, Lord. So much has been disrupted this year. And it feels like brokenness is just there. And to cope, we cover it over. We cover it with dirt. We cover it with something that feels good. We cover it with a Band-Aid. But yet that brokenness continues to fester underneath. God, right now in our nation, there's so much division. In the church, there's so much division. It's unbelievable, God, how broken it feels. And all glory be to you, God, because you are the answer. And I thank you, God, for your word that helped me at least, to have a better understanding, God, of how this divide has kind of grown to what it is. And you've given us some handles, God, of how to work towards completeness in your will, to live aligned with you, not as if with you, but one that has pressed in and continues to press in to be the person that you created us to be. God, I need it. I believe we need it as a church, and I know that others outside desperately need it. So, Father, would you move in us? Would you stir in our heart? Would you stir in our spirits a desire, a longing for this healing, a longing to press into the work of ourself and the external work of our relationships? Would we take it seriously? Would we recognize that both are deeply important in your eyes? And that as we do that, that would bring you glory. Others would see it and be drawn into relationship with yourself through your church here. So One Lake City Church, would we have the courage to do the hard work? Would we have the courage to ask the hard questions? Would we have the courage to walk alongside one another and start to point out maybe ways that our lives are a little off? Would we do it in a loving, truthful way with an intent to walk with that person? Would we wait expectantly for how our church will continue to be a greater reflection of your beauty, of your heart, to ourselves, to each other here, and to others around us? So I thank you, God, for today. I thank you for your wisdom. In Jesus' name we pray.